Well, I'm just tempted to say, listening to Bernard, it is being so cheerful that keeps him going. I thought I'd just give you a slightly different take on this, having read and enjoyed the report very much. I thought I would talk a bit about the interface between reforms and policy and politics and how that's playing out at the moment. I think the generally downbeat mood that we heard from the speakers so far does reflect real concern about the future of the government's reform programme. At the same time, I think we should acknowledge at the start that this is an extremely ambitious reform programme, and that's something that when I travel about doing comparative public policy engagements, I find a lot of countries very interested in what Britain is doing. So I would just perhaps encourage people sometimes to just take the lens back a bit from the day-to-day problems of policy delivery and just say that actually this is, whatever else one says about the coalition's reform agenda, it is certainly very broad, and I think, did start out with highly ambitious intentions. I think now they need perhaps to refocus, and I'll try to explain why a bit. I mean, I think one of the things that is very obvious if we look at the way that which reforms are working well and which are not, it is the areas where there has been clear focus from the start about a clearly deliverable objective, a timescale to do it on, and a person's name pinned to it. I suspect this is not too different from corporate life. So if we look at something which is sort of generally thought to have gone reasonably well, which is the launch of the free schools policy, it has worked well because it had quite, everyone knew sort of what it was. You could agree with it or disagree with it, but you sort of knew a free school when you saw one. The Education Secretary, Michael Gove, was very strongly associated with it and with the idea from opposition onwards, and I would say that that has been an absolute curse of areas which have ended up in an omni-shambles like healthcare reform, because no one person other than the minister who had too tight a grip on his vision alone of what should happen ended up with any sort of stake in it. Political capital is one of the most important things in delivering reforms. I mean, we talked a lot, or Bernard talked a lot, about the civil service, and I broadly agree with him. I think there is still an awful lot to do in changing the civil service. But frankly, had I a pound for every year, 16 years of writing political columns when very, very bright ministers have complained to me about the civil service, stopping them implementing their plans, well, I don't know, I'd be investing it in Deloitte would be telling me what to do with it. So if we're looking at where things don't go well, I think, healthcare and the health bill would be an area which not even the most ardent reformers would say had gone well. And the reason that it failed, and I think we've ended up with a very, very bad bill. I think it is something that is going to make the cuts at the front line, which is what efficiency savings often are in practice, come home to people in a way that will put them off healthcare reform for a very long period. And I think that is a terrible price to be paid. The message was so muddled at the outset about what these reforms were intended to achieve, compare and contrast with free schools. The vow to ring-fence NHS spending before the election, in effect telling the voters the status quo is affordable, became the millstone around the neck of the reforms. And then the complete failure, which I do not understand to this day, how Number 10 allowed this to happen, having seen what Tony Blair has said a number of times, scars on my back, difficulties of the NHS, how often do you have to get booed by the Royal College of Nurses before the message gets home? It's difficult. The stakeholders are powerful. The stakeholders have a lot of support, and also they influence a lot of other voters. So do not blunder into it without thinking that you're going into a major battle. And I still, I think it's a very interesting story still to be written, really, about how some reforms ended up in a state where they were clearly being launched without anyone having thought about how they were going to win the political battle. I think the coalition has been strongest when it's been honest with the voters. And it's been honest with the voters, as it sees it, about the deficit, and therefore, if you look at its fairly lamentable polling at the moment, you'll see it still does have a lead on that, and it still has an economic competence lead. Not, I think, because people are absolutely convinced by its growth strategy, assuming they can find it, but because they do know where its intentions lie. And where I think the government comes off course is when it bifurcates or obfuscates about what its reforms are intended to do. And this is why I think they do need a refocus. And the areas, some of which have been picked up today, that I would suggest that they do need to be more honest with the voters are as follows. There is an inherent tension in this breed of coalition reformer between the localist and the centralist. And it is, I think, come to a head, and because so much else was happening last week, but I think that the failure to get through elected mayors is something, it's a slow burn, but it is something that needs very, very careful thought about what its consequences are and what it symbolises about the reforms. The tensions, I think, are probably obvious to a lot of us, but they do tend to multiply when you layer one idea for reform mayors, in this case over another, police commissioners, without the two clearly meshing up. I suppose you could argue that that has at least been resolved, because now we'll only have police commissioners. But I suspect that a lot of the same arguments and concerns are going to recur. And this is a classic case where political capital was not put behind the idea. As it happens, I'm a fan of elected mayors. As it happens, I can also see that if you go to the public and say, would you like to have another highly paid official on the books, that their answer might be no. So either you take it to the voters and you explain from really about a year out why this would directly benefit them, and you sell it as part of a reform package. If you simply go out and say, would you like a mayor? The answer was, by a 10-to-1 margin, no, we wouldn't. Thank you very much. That would worry me if I were in government, because localism is a big driver of these reforms. Yes, you can do something with tax receipts. It was interesting hearing the Chairman's comments about the very limited amount of scope that there is there. Yes, you can come up with whizzy ideas for growth, and as we all know, that is an area where, you know, the proof of the pudding simply is in the eating, and it's extremely hard, I think, to come up with an industrial policy that you just get ready-baked and works within your electoral time frame. But one of the things that was mainly intended to change was local decision-making, local people, local responsibility. So switching on my radio halfway through Thursday, or I suppose by this stage, sorry, Friday, to find Grant Shapps, the minister responsible, saying, well, we never intended to impose mayors on you. What was all that about then? So, you know, here is something where there are tensions between the local and the central. They exist, for instance, in academies, and in free schools particularly, where you have a situation where if they fail, if there's any sort of problem, let alone outright failure, responsibility reverts to Michael Gove sitting down the road in Westminster, which is a long way for most people's local free school. I would simply be honest with the voters about this tension and say sometimes we're choosing the local route and sometimes we're not. The answer, I think, Nicholas Bowles raised the question about what we would do if there had failures in the academy sector on private providers. Well, on providers, I would say, Nicholas, you know, if you had the courage of your conviction and let in private providers, you would have a mechanism to deal with failure. If you don't allow for-profit providers, then you don't have a mechanism. And that's another case where, you know, so the best has been the enemy of the good a bit, that because they didn't want to have the argument in government about whether you could make a profit out of schools, which I think many, particularly Conservative reformers, would love to do it, and actually probably so would Nick Clegg, but he can't tell his own party. If you miss the moment to have that argument, and I suspect you have, then when things go pear-shaped, what are you going to do? Does the minister simply step in from Whitehall again? I think this is, you know, I would like to see this put back onto the agenda, but I am concerned that the government feels very much on the back foot. Implementation. Well, civil service, yes, that is certainly part of it. But the thing about implementation, really, I mean, particularly having watched the Blair-era reforms in some mind-numbing detail, is that where there is a reason for people's careers to be strongly associated with the success or failure of a reform, and where they have a real personal enthusiasm, although things get tough, they rarely come completely off the rails. And I was just thinking about that as I happened to be doing a panel with Andrew Adonis, Lord Adonis, the other day. You know, there is a man whose whole career is tied up with his launch of the Academy's programme. And I think that sense of commitment and that sense of ministers sort of wanting to ally themselves to a big idea and being prepared to see it through and being prepared for the first, I remember the first years of the academies when I was supporting them on the Evening Standard, every report that came out, you know, said there's something else wrong with them. And you have to go through that period of adjusting your model. You also have to be prepared to stick with it and sometimes go and expand things that you really believe are going to be beneficial, and you have to go through the fire for it. Where I'm a little confused about the coalition is sort of who feels driven by what. I'm very confused about what the Prime Minister wants. And I think that is not a good thing for reform. I think we knew in the end Tony Blair started education, education, education. Funnily enough, by the end, he'd probably moved over to health, 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 because it frustrated him so much. But I think in both cases, he did put a lot of political capital behind it. And he was very frustrated when, particularly on health, he was ultimately outmaneuvered by Gordon Brown. But it bothered him. He talked about it all the time. So far, I may be wrong about this, but so far I don't get the feeling that if I sort of tap David Cameron on the shoulder, the first thing that he would say to me is, I'm very frustrated by the failure of this reform or that measure. And I think we need to hear that from the centre. And also, before we only blame the officials, as enjoyable as that is, ministers too. Ministers have to choose, and ministers also have to choose what they'd like to be associated with. Clearly there's going to be a reshuffle. Clearly the health secretary is probably going to be a different one shortly. In fact, many jobs may be different shortly. You have, after 2 years, you get about one false start, really, with reshuffles. And then after that, you've really got to settle people into things that they're keen to deliver and want to deliver over the long term. And other part of my life, apart from The Economist, is sort of doing arts broadcasting. And one of the things that I've done there is make a documentary about the musical tastes of this generation in politics, called the Jam Generation, for anyone out there of a similar ilk. And when I was talking to David Cameron about it, and kindly gave us an interview about his musical taste, he had a whole sort of list of people he really liked listening to from the 80s. And one of them was Joe Jackson, who, as you may remember, sang, "You can't get what you want till you know what you want." And that, to me, that is the anthem of reform. It's very simple. There is an awful lot of things that can cloud your vision, things that come across what you're trying to do, and of course the political cycle with all its vagaries and inconvenient things like local elections. But, this reform programme is a good one on the whole, and it's worth sticking with. And as soon as the coalition refocuses and decides what it wants, it has, I think, a chance of delivering. I don't want to contrast too formally with Bernard. I think there's bits of it that can still look like a success. We have a long-term, 5-year term in which to do it. 2 years is too soon to be completely bearish, but they do really have to know what they want.